Hell looks at the impact of the Iraq War on radical jihadist groups. Mr. Scheuer argues that U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War has weakened our national security. This program, hosted by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., is 50 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. I thought I'd just talk a little bit about why I wrote the book. There was a bit of an unfavorable review in the New York Times yesterday, but I stopped this morning and had my DNA checked, and I found out that I'm at least part of the human species, and so you're all safe from someone who's not. I started to write the book. I had no intention of writing a third book on this issue, but I wanted to try to undo some of the things that I thought had been done as a disservice to America by the 9/11 commissioners. Not because of any special talent of myself, but because of the position I was in. I had an unusual window on what happened before 9/11. And I resigned from the agency primarily so I could speak on that. As you well know, the commissioners found no one responsible for anything before 9/11. And so the book started out to be kind of a review of both what I had seen and what I do regard as the rather self-serving and deliberate falsehoods published by people like Mr. Tennant and Richard Clark. And I also tried in the book to lead anybody who can make an FOIA request to the documents that will show that. As the more I got into it, though, the more I began to wonder how often, if at all, protecting Americans comes first in the eyes of our political leaders, no matter who's in office. And the more I looked, I thought that probably ought to be, maybe naively, the sort of organizing concept of the American government, that protecting Americans ought to come first. It was not, in my experience, always the first priority of either Democrats or Republicans when they held office, but the more I did the research, the more it seemed to me that it very seldom was. In covert action, when we were proposing programs at the agency, more often than not, the first thing that was worried about was whether the Post would find out about it or the New York Times would find out about it, and would they laugh at us if something went wrong. The next thing was the Europeans. For all the talk about this particular president not caring what the world thinks of us, this government and the previous ones that I served under put extraordinary value on what the Europeans are going to say about what we do. Mr. Zarqawi lived, for example, to kill more Americans or help kill more Americans than Saddam's army did in 2 wars, because President Bush and his colleagues were much more concerned about not offending the Germans and the French before we went to war in Iraq in 2003. Then there's Muslim opinion. We don't want to offend Muslim opinion, and so we didn't kill bin Laden when we had the opportunity to do so. Then there's always the fear of losing arms sales, especially to Arabs. We didn't go after bin Laden as hard as we could have in the 90s or 95, because we wanted to help put a pipeline through Afghanistan, and we needed the Taliban for that. Then there's always re-election considerations. It's getting too close to the election to do anything. Mr. Clark writes in his book that just before the 2000 election, they had a chance to either go after the training camps where, as it turned out, the 9/11 hijackers were training, or they could try for Arab-Israeli peace. And of course they went for the latter. It was feckless, and we all know what happened after that. And then after those kind of 5 things comes protecting Americans, if there's time to get around to it. And I thought that was a very, very disturbing kind of realization, both from looking at documents, from interviewing people, and from my own personal experience. And I think if there's one thing that I would point to, if anybody disagrees with that, is I try to relate in the book that since 1982, which encompasses now several administrations from both parties, we have been terrorist voyeurs in a sense. We have watched the construction and operation of terrorist training camps in Afghanistan and Yemen, in the Sudan, Chechnya, Kashmir, the Philippines, Indonesia, Eritrea, around the world, and have done absolutely nothing about it. The only terrorist training camps we have ever attacked have been ones in Afghanistan. I think it's very likely that we have grossly underestimated the number of people who have been trained in the camps we know of, and of course we don't know of all the camps that exist. But on the CIA shelves now, there are volume after volume, almost, it's kind of flip to say, but the intelligence community produced every year a yearbook, if you will, of terrorist training camps around the world, describing how many people were trained there, what kind of training they received, who was funding it, what the facilities looked like. It included maps and overhead imagery and other kinds of photographs. And since 1982, the only ones that I'm aware of that were hit were the ones that were hit in August 98, after our embassies were bombed, and then the camps that were destroyed in southeastern Afghanistan after 2001. To me, that's an extraordinary dereliction of duty, but I raise that for what it's worth, and as an example of the fact that the enemy we're now facing is extraordinarily larger than really anybody, I think, has a grip on. A third thing that came about, or I thought of, or at least became apparent to me, is that we really, for all the talk about we're out of the Cold War era, we need new thinking, out-of-the-box thinking, we still think very much in terms of the way we thought during the Cold War. I tend to think in looking back that the Cold War was America's out-of-the-box experience. It was the first time that any two countries had the ability to annihilate each other and probably the world in the course of a few weeks. And I think all praise and glory go to the men who managed and women who managed us through that 50-year period. But now we continue to operate. For example, we operate as if we still had time on our side, that things can be done when the Americans are ready to do them, and they will follow, of course, what the Americans want. When we encountered a surprise from the Soviets and they were building a new fighter plane, for example, we would convoke industry, the military, the national laboratories, and plan a fighter plane to counter the one that would be better than the one the Soviets were building. Of course, it would take 7 or 8 years. We don't have that kind of time anymore, and yet we proceed on the basis that we do have time. I mentioned earlier Mr. Clark's book about, well, we can get to those training camps later. Let's take care of the Arab-Israeli thing now. I think that's a mistake. And if you read the Iraq Study Group, a report of Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Baker, it's extraordinary, because it basically says, yeah, Iraq's a mess, but it's a matter of management. We have to train more people who can collect taxes in Iraq. The Europeans have to train more Iraqi policemen. We have to do this better. But it's just a matter of management. And what kind of occurred to me over time was we look at the world as if it's a tennis game where we hit the ball over the net and then go around and hit it back to ourselves. And there's really no enemy on the other side of the net. Well, I'm afraid there is an enemy on the other side. And he's thinking, he's adaptable, terrifically flexible and creative. And I don't think that is soaked in yet. Another aspect of the Cold War, I think, that continues very much to this day is the idea of using proxies to do our own dirty work. I don't think there's a better example possible than Pakistan. We successfully used proxies against the Soviets, whether it was in Nicaragua or in Angola or in Afghanistan. But those proxies were going to fight for themselves. They weren't dying for the Americans. They weren't doing anything for us except killing people we wanted killed. And our contribution to that was to provide them with weaponry that helped them kill Soviets, for example, in Afghanistan more efficiently. They weren't doing it for us, they were doing it for them. We somehow have missed the point that proxies now, we're asking them to do things they wouldn't be doing for themselves. Pakistan, for example, had no interest in taking on the Taliban. The Taliban was a dream come true for them in Afghanistan. And they really had no beef with Al-Qaeda. But they have done, in my mind, Pakistan has done a tremendous amount for us. And yet in Washington, the question is always, what did you do for me lately? If you look at what Musharraf did, whether it's giving us access for more of our forces around his country, intelligence and military, overflight routes, all of the people we captured in Pakistan in the cities were because of the assistance of his police and intelligence services. The port of Karachi is virtually a U.S. naval base at the moment. And he sent for the first time in Pakistan's history his conventional army up into the border where they were defeated, but brought his country to the brink of civil war, all on our behalf. Now, yeah, he got some money in return for it. He got some billions of dollars in return for it. But nonetheless, none of those things were anything they would have done without our insistence. But I don't think that we should ever assume that a proxy is going to destroy his country on our behalf. And I think that's what we think Musharraf should be doing, somehow pressing this to the end. And we will do just about anything to avoid doing the dirty work of war ourselves. And to me, Pakistan is exactly the best example of that. Interventionism was kind of another of my own, has long been one of my own interests, that we are in both parties in the United States completely addicted, enamored of intervention, whether it's in the form of rifles or intervening with Planned Parenthood or Franklin Graham and the Bible guys. There's nothing on this earth we think that doesn't matter to America and doesn't require our intervention. I think the greatest example of that, it just occurred recently when all three of the candidates that are left in the election took time out to sing the praises of the Kosovar's declaration of independence from Serbia. None of the three of them seemed to realize that we had helped the Europeans light the fuse to a new Balkans war in the future, and probably committing our prestige to having young Americans killed in a useless, pointless war of no concern to America. And that is, I'm afraid, our lot as a people. Certainly there is no one of the three candidates left who's going to stop intervening. My God, McCain wants to go to Darfur and spend the lives of our young people and our own fortunes there for reasons that are completely beyond me. Certainly we're not going to leave Iraq because of our intervention in the Arab-Israeli war. We can't leave Iraq. If we leave Iraq, Israel's security is compromised to a degree that will be unacceptable to the Israelis, and so they will persuade, perhaps is a better word, us to remain there. I think Mr. Obama's recent effusive praise for the Israelis is a pretty clear example that no matter who gets in power, Iraq is going to continue to meander along at high cost to us. I guess finally I would say that one of the things that convinced me most to write the book was a a matter of history that it became pretty apparent. I think, let me step back. I think we can forgive Mr. Bush or Mr. Cheney or Mr. Clinton or any of our leaders, Mrs. Clinton, with not knowing an awful lot about the Islamic world or about the methods of prayer or the traditions of the Prophet. But I don't think we can forgive them, or should, for not knowing anything at all about our own history. It seems to me that we have a generation of leaders who either are ignorant of American history or have very little respect or empathy for what we've created here on this continent. If you pick a random date, perhaps Runnymede would be a good place to start in 1215. We have been at this business for 800 years. We had 150 years of self-governing experience in North America before the Declaration of Independence. We may not be quite perfect yet. Women have been voting for less than 100 years, and we didn't have a Voting Rights Act until 40 years ago. So I think you can forgive Americans for not, American leaders for not knowing as much as they probably should about the world, but you can't forgive them for not knowing our own history and somehow expecting to put that 800 years of history on a CD-ROM and give it to Shalaby or Maliki or Karzai and say, you have 6 months or 6 years to replicate this, replicate this history in your country. I think that's an extraordinary piece of arrogance or ignorance, take your pick. On the specific issue of terrorism, I'm afraid I couldn't find a way not to repeat what I repeated in the first couple of books I wrote to some extent. We're losing this war. We're losing it hands down. We're not even in competition, primarily because we're still stuck with a political class that insists that we're being attacked because of how we live, because we have democracy and because we have voting and we have women in the workplace. And of course that has virtually nothing to do with what this war is about. This war has to do with the impact of what at least the Islamic world regards as intervention in their world. And whether we regard it that way or not, perception is reality. And the perception that we are intervening in their world to make things worse for Muslims is the reason we're at war. If we were at war with people who were intent on dying because we had women in the workplace, we would face a lethal nuisance, not a national security threat. And so 12 years after bin Laden's declaration of war, 7 years after 9/11, we still don't have a clue about an enemy that's far more dangerous to us than anything we have described to the American people. That's powered by what we do, not who we are. And is certainly driven by religion. The endless Islam is a religion of peace chant by our leaders is surely the truth. All great religions are religions of peace unless they feel cornered. And I'm afraid many in the Muslim world feel cornered by Western intervention. We don't teach history very well. We always say the Muslim world needs a reformation. We don't always say that there was 100 years of fierce religious wars in Europe because of the Reformation. This is something I don't know if we can overcome, but we're certainly not doing America any favors by not recognizing the religious dimensions of this war. It wasn't long ago when people would take pride in fighting for their religion, but somehow that's a negative thought in America these days. Perhaps most distressing, we have politicians in both parties who can't go to the safe way without looking at polls, and the Middle East Institute and other people around town surely have now polling information in the Islamic world for the past 15 years that's very reputable, very thorough, and there's nothing in that that would suggest the motivation of our enemy is a hatred for the way we live. Those polls in most Muslim countries show majorities, and sometimes large ones, that admire the way American parents can feed and educate their children, find housing, find employment, speak their mind. I don't think we would have Muslim families moving into America if they thought they were bringing their children to a vile environment. And yet we continue to say that that's the reason they hate us, because of our lifestyle. The same polls show that 80% of Muslims, according to the University of Maryland's poll in the middle of last year, share bin Laden's view that our foreign policies are an attack on Islam. 80% is a pretty big number. I think any candidate in our country would be happy to have that approval rating. But we seem to not be able to comprehend that in our own minds. So I think that there's nothing but bad news out there for us. And if you listen to some of especially the Democrats, but the Republicans also, the future is a new Marshall Plan in the Middle East. Terrorism is still caused by poverty and illiteracy and unemployment and the lack of hope, which of course flies in the face of all of the recent research that shows that if Al-Qaeda appeals to any group in the Muslim world, it appeals to the best and the brightest, the middle and the upper middle class, the educated. It's always extraordinary to me to hear a public figure declaim about how illiteracy foments terrorism when Al-Qaeda probably spends 60% of its budget on the internet and internet programs, which to me suggests they may not be looking for illiterates. I think that I'll stop there and ask questions. And let you ask questions if you have any. Those are the basic reasons I tried to write the book. I thought, and do think, America is in a very bad problem here. It is a problem on the bright side that's largely of our own making. We are the only entity that can resolve, decrease the animosity of the enemy toward us. We create our foreign policy. We implement it. We keep it in place. It's the only indispensable ally that Al-Qaeda, the Islamists generally have. To the extent that American foreign policy changes in a way that we can disengage from the Middle East, exactly to that extent will the focus on America as the main enemy decrease. I should add one word, one last thought. I am very prone to believe that at some point we're going to have to wage war as aggressively as we can in a place of our choosing. I think we have built an extraordinary contempt amongst our enemies because we refuse to employ the military power that Americans have paid for to the greatest extent. I think a strong man who won't use his power is generally held in contempt, and certainly that's the case places in Iraq, like Iraq, Afghanistan. At some point we were going to have to be much more ruthless in the traditional American manner than we have been any time in the last 50 years. I leave it there, I think, Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. We'll take questions. I think there'll probably be plenty of questions, many provocative comments. Ought to be very interesting. If I could ask you to, when we call on you, to wait until you get the microphone, because we're picking this up on C-SPAN and we want to give our audiences throughout the world the opportunity to also hear your question. And if you could identify yourself and your affiliation. Thank you. A Pakistan question, no doubt.
Thank you, Michael.
Sir.
Two-part question. You obviously don't like what happened and what is happening. What is the counterfactual? And specifically in Pakistan, having gotten the Pakistan Army involved almost sort of 6 years too late in Fatah. What would you suggest be done now?
So I think Afghanistan is lost for the United States and its allies. I think we're watching NATO bleed to death on, in Kipling's term, on the Afghan plains. But what are we going to do? There are 20-some million Pashtuns. Are we going to invade with the number of troops? We don't have enough troops there to have a constabulary that could control the country. The disaster occurred at the beginning. The fools who ran our government, who thought that a few hundred CIA officers and a few hundred special intelligence or special forces officers and soldiers could take a country the size of Texas and hold it, were quite literally fools. And now we're paying the price. Probably too late to do anything about it. Again, it's the cost of not knowing history. History can't tell you what to do, but it certainly can give you an idea of what not to do. What we're experiencing in Afghanistan now is exactly what the Soviets experienced, the British experienced, Alexander experienced it 4 centuries before Christ. I don't think there's any way out of it. I think the only thing they're hoping for is they kill bin Laden and then they can declare victory and go home. But there's not enough soldiers. If we took everybody from Iraq, it wouldn't solve the problem. So I think we're probably closer to defeat in Afghanistan than we are in Iraq at the moment. But I think just on your point, sending the I would have bet, and I don't get my pension for 6 years yet, but I would have bet my pension that Musharraf would never have done that. And just that alone, to me, is something that if I was in the U.S. government, I would be saying, what more can you ask of this government? Leave Musharraf aside. What more can you ask? But again, the question is always, what did he do for me yesterday?
Perhaps I could just jump in here because I had something to do with that Musharraf decision at that time, having been the serving ambassador in Pakistan, and on September 13, delivering the démarche to Musharraf, in which I was instructed to say, are you with us or are you against us? And what I was able to say to President Musharraf was, are you with us or are you against us? Now, I know you're with us because we've talked. I had a long session with Musharraf, and he had told me before 9/11, in fact in August, that he was very concerned about the internal terrorism within his own country, wanted to find a way to get rid of that terrorism, but didn't feel he could when with this albatross of their support for the Taliban. So his mind was already in the direction of breaking the policy with support to the Taliban. He told me in August of 2001 that he had no truck at all for al-Qaeda. So it wasn't such a very difficult negotiation to make. So I would sort of take issue with that. Question here?
Herman Franson, Middle East Institute. We have, as you indicated, a very bad situation here, but somehow we have to find a way out. Now, let us assume in January we have a new president, and he or she appoints you as the director of Middle East in the National Security Council. What would your advice be to him or her?
I would first advise the president to find psychiatric help if I was the choice. I don't think it's hard at all. I think it's a matter of telling the American people the truth. There's no other way to start but to say, listen, we've been lying to you for the last 5 administrations. They don't care if you wear short dresses in Milwaukee. They don't care if you have beer after work, and they don't care if you vote 8 times a month in Iowa. They don't like what we're doing in their world. Now, if we want to keep what we're doing and what we have been doing going, then get ready for a very long, very bloody, very expensive war. If that's what you want, that's what we'll do. Or we might be able to find another way out of this. I don't think any specific thing you can do, you should do any specific thing first, but to tell the American people the truth. Because right now they're being led down a blind alley of endless war and expense. After that, I think the first thing on the agenda is energy. And you can see all of the shills have come out for both parties about let the market decide and innovation will take care of this and it's a fungible commodity. Well, we're paying for oil in the lives of Marines and soldiers. And it's not just in the Islamic world. When we get ready and have to fight a war in 27,000 square kilometers of swamp in the Gulf of Guinea, then that's going to be a problem. So it seems to me energy is the place to start after you tell the American people the truth and find some way to shut up AEI's shills for the energy industry and Daniel Yergin and the rest of them. And listen to that character. There's a guy out there called Gal Luft, L-U-F-T, who has written some very interesting things about the shift from energy being just a economic issue to being a very, very important national security issue for America. If you look at it objectively, I think you could say when we next celebrate the 4th of July, we're a far less independent nation than we were 20 years ago because we don't have the decision over peace and war when it comes to energy anymore. We go to war if somebody pulls our chain, whether it's the Eastern Province or the Niger Delta.
And please say your name and affiliation.
My name is Ron Zwart. I'm formerly with the Department of Defense. How do you explain the absence of another terrorist attack within the United States since 9/11?
The extraordinary cleverness and the ignorance of the media in allowing our politicians, clever politicians, to describe this war only in terms of the detonation of explosives. If war was only about exploding munitions, it wouldn't be hard to fight. America has been under attack every day since 9/11. We're mired in 2 wars we're losing. We're spending, how much? $12 billion a month in Iraq, some billion in Afghanistan. The domestic political cohesion of this country is probably more shaken than it has been since Vietnam. And look at the intentions of the enemy. The intentions of the enemy have been threefold, clearly stated over the past 10 years. Bleed us to bankruptcy, spread out our forces, and destroy domestic political cohesion. I think if I am in a cave in Afghanistan and I'm Osama, I'm doing the happy dance. The one thing I would say is they have themselves in a box. One of the few places they left themselves no room for maneuver is on the escalation of attacks, the escalation of damaging attacks. The escalation of the damage of each attack. I get it right eventually. Every attack since '92 has been incrementally more powerful and more destructive. And so now they're in the place of having to attack us again with something more destructive than 9/11. And so we're waiting for that. The idea that somehow they can't do it is a figment of our imagination. We have wide open borders. We have wide open ports. We keep pumping visas into Saudi Arabia for students to come here. We haven't taken the time to control or finish controlling the Soviet nuclear arsenal. The one thing I would say is my own suspicion, and it's a speculation, that there is a discussion in al-Qaeda's councils about whether or not they should attack now. I think success has come so fast to them since 9/11 that they may not want to attack now because they might rally the American people to the president and undo some of the progress they've made so far. But I think that the main reason we even talk about it is because the politicians have framed it, and the media has let them frame it only in terms of explosions.
Charles Murn, freelance writer. I'm wondering where, how you consider the portrayal of the Al-Qaeda movement and those associated with it as a revolutionary movement within Islam itself. I was living in India on September 11th and was struck by reports just days later of the usual kind of attacks, for example, in Pakistan, of Sunni on Shi'i and vice versa. How does that fit into your overall picture? I'm surprised you didn't talk about it a little bit more.
I think one thing that I and I tried to rectify it in this book, is I did not, in the first two books I wrote, give enough consideration to the sort of liberation or revolutionary fervor that is included in what bin Laden represents. Of all of the indictments, I tend to think that even worse than our support for Israel is our support for the fascist governments that govern most of the Middle East and the Arab world. I think there's a very strong liberation. Some of the Pakistani press, interestingly, has been very analytic on this point, saying of all people on earth, we never expected the Americans not to understand the dissatisfaction of people with oppressive governments. The Sunni versus Shia business, that's a battle that's going to be fought. Al-Qaeda is very clear that the third step in their process, get the Americans out of the Middle East, get rid of Israel and the governments, and then go after the heretics. I think that's going to come. I think it's going to come in Iraq. Our whole, at least it appears to me, our whole position in Iraq is now dependent on Muqtada al-Sadr maintaining his ceasefire, which why shouldn't he? Since we're killing Sunnis, he'll have to kill less of them later. But I think, at least in the Sunni world, the current attendant to Al-Qaeda's ideology of liberation is more important than I thought it was, and something that we ought to factor in when we think about this movement. We talk about a lot about, or at least the right does, and to some extent it's becoming common in both political parties, about Islamo-fascists. And there's a lot of them out there, and they're all on our side. They're the Saudis, they're the Kuwaitis, and the Jordanians, and the Egyptians. So we happen to be on the wrong side of what we say is the winning side of history on that regard.
Samia Kabariti from the Embassy of Jordan. I just want to ask, you mentioned that there's a political class here which believe that they are being attacked for their democracy and lifestyle. And why is it so difficult for them to comprehend that this is not the case, in your opinion? Is it because they don't want
It's very
to
politically
take
useful.
advice?
I'm sorry for my voice. It's much easier to scare Americans by saying tomorrow morning, if you don't keep up the battle, your granddaughters are going to have to wear burqas to Catholic school, than to say we're sending your young daughters and sons overseas to die so the Al Sauds can keep raping their country of the financial profits of oil. It's a matter of issues. If there's a touch of genius in bin Laden, and I think there's more than a touch, he has identified a set of foreign policy issues that are uniquely intertwined in the American political system. Taking on Israel, I can vouch, is a martyrdom operation in this country. There's no politician that's going to go out on the hustings and say, listen, whether you want to support Israel or not is one question, but not to recognize that it's a burdenous cancer on our foreign policy and our relation with the Islamic world is simply a matter of fact. It's not even open for debate, but there's no politician that's going to go out there. There's no politician that's going to go out there and say, listen, we're supporting tyranny in the Muslim world because we need energy. And to get away from that situation, we have to invest X number of tax dollars. So we have to have higher oil prices. There's no leadership in the sense of doing hard things in the United States at the moment. So we fall back on, if we don't fight this battle, tomorrow morning there's going to be a caliphate around the world, and you're going to have to grow a beard and wear a robe and all these kind of things. So scaremongering is always good vote catching. And I think we don't listen. One of the extraordinary things to me is, and nobody seems to have, it hasn't bothered anybody, but we have given the Islamists a huge victory in the last just 60 days by Obama having to go onto the public television and in the media and say, I would never be a Muslim. That's like being a subhuman. I'm a Christian. I've always been a Christian. I'll always be a Christian. Extraordinary. Extraordinary problem.
Tom Gallagher, National Endowment for Democracy. You characterised a lot of regimes in the Middle East as fascist.
Yes.
Inevitably, that makes me wonder
Yes.
what Osama bin Laden is, and if America has been in bed with these tyrannical forces, then surely it isn't such a drastic transition for someone, perhaps yourself, to go and speak to bin Laden, perhaps indirectly, because if your thesis becomes representative and starts to be well supported, then I think it will inevitably lead to a demand for talking to bin Laden to be characterised in less demonic terms. Maybe the fact that he's a middle class type of revolutionary with aims which are not inimical to the United States.
I'd much rather kill him than talk to him.
You would much rather
I'd
kill
much
him?
rather kill him than talk to him, though the British seem, over the weekend, to be more inclined to talk to him than I am. My own view is that we need to stop the democracy mongering. It doesn't matter to any American if anyone on this earth ever votes in an election who's not voting today. It's an absolute insanity that Bush came up with. I think he probably got a few genes transferred from Woodrow Wilson, that somehow American freedoms and liberties depend on us giving other people those same freedoms and liberties. I think, with respect, that one of the most disastrous things we do is push for democracy in countries that either aren't interested in it, aren't ready for it. I don't know why that's in America's interest. It clearly has nothing to do with the republic that our founders founded. The founders don't have anything to say about intercontinental missiles or subways. They have everything to say about why republics fail. That was their specialty. And their conclusion was republics fail. One of the reasons they fail is faction. Another one is involvement overseas in trying to spread their kind of government. And I think we're proving that right now. We're in the midst of destroying our republic by trying to install it in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. We operate on a fantasy on the issue of democracy. They always say, well, if there's more democracies, they won't fight. Well, our Civil War was between the two freest democracies on earth. So.
Question here.
Greg Myrie with the Middle East Institute. I'd like you to address the seeming contradiction between your notion that the United States would have to fight an expanded campaign, and then how would this increased intervention not create further conflict and friction?
Well, I would say there's not much. If 80% of the Muslim world thinks you're intent on destroying Islam and Muslims, you don't have a lot of room to expand that view. But I do think you need to establish that you are a credible military power. We have an enemy now that kind of looks around and said, we really don't like that Air Force business. But once we ride that out, these guys are not very formidable. They suffer a few thousand casualties, they're going to go home. I really do think that the next time we need to fight these folks, it may be too late. We may have decided to lose in Iraq and Afghanistan. That may be the case. But if there comes another time when we have to fight, we're going to have to fight in a much more destructive manner, simply to lay down a marker that you don't screw with us without cost. And personally, we haven't won a war since 1945, so I wouldn't mind seeing us win one, for the Gipper or otherwise.
Any more questions? Yes. Just a moment.
Daily Times, Lahore. You seem to suggest as if Al-Qaeda was some kind of a super government, some kind of a world government, internationally organized. What is your basis? What is your evidence?
No, I don't think that's at all the case. In fact, I think they remain what they've always been, a relatively small insurgent organization who looks as their intention, their main goal, their main activity is inciting others. I think what we have at the moment is a situation where we have failed to destroy Al-Qaeda and have allowed it to generate a whole new tier of threat from people who are not associated with it but inspired by it, whether it's those folks that were in the United Kingdom or in Spain or in the United States. I think the mistake is to view it as a worldwide, omnipresent, omnipotent organization. It's very powerful within its own small dimension. It's much more powerful as a symbol and the impact it has had as an inciting tool around the world. If it was a centralized organization, you probably could destroy it, although we're not very good at that anymore.
Thank you. Jim Plack, Cambridge Energy Research Associates. In advocating effectively a U.S. disengagement from the Middle East in every respect, what is your view of what would take its place?
I'm not sure if it wasn't for oil, why we should care. They'll sort it out. We tend to forget that they have had political societies for each of them probably 1,000 years longer than we have. Certainly, we've certainly forgotten that in Afghanistan. They've been there for 2,000 years, and somehow we think we have something to teach them about how to organize a polity. If it wasn't for oil, why would we care? You look at the Arabian Peninsula. There's nothing on the Arabian Peninsula that's worth the life of a Marine if it wasn't for oil. We could sell them all guns and they could kill each other if that's what they really wanted. You know, if Israel disappeared tomorrow and the Palestinians disappeared tomorrow, who cares? In the sense of American security or in the sense of the everyday life of Americans, what would be affected? I think that's kind of what's the basis of your decision. If we don't do something in X country, is America worse off? And if the answer is no, why do anything? You know, we tend to say that if, well, the Islamists take power, it'll be terrible for us. Well, Iran is a more participatory democratic system than any of our allies in the Middle East. Certainly much less of a threat than Saudi Arabia. So I'm not sure we need to care. It's kind of the syndrome of Americans to believe that we have to be involved in everywhere and everything that happens in the world is important to us. I don't think that's the case. If 2 million Rwandans can be killed and without us doing anything, what did it do in the United States? It didn't do anything. Sir.
Let me follow up on that, if I may. Do you know where the Middle East is located? It's at the intersection of 3 continents.
I'm sorry?
It's at the intersection of 3 continents. Mm-hmm. That's not important?
Sure, it's important for freedom of navigation. We got a Navy to take care of that. But again, if you can make a case that it matters for us who rules Kuwait, if it wasn't for energy, then of course we should. But the case has to be made. It can't be assumed. And right now we assume that everything that happens is of importance to us. And right now it is because of oil. Remove oil and I don't think the equation is the same.
I'm wondering, you mentioned in response to one other question that you supported serious invasion as intervention and as a method of fighting. Do you see any other military role, like what John Kerry was suggesting in 2004, getting 40,000 more special operations troops to send teams of 6 guys to do assassinations or that sort of thing?
I think if we've proven anything over the past 6 or 7 years is that you can't win wars with special forces in the clandestine service. I think what we've proven is we've ruined our special forces and our clandestine service by overuse. Assassinations, I think, are probably a very good thing to think about. A 9mm cartridge into Saddam's head would have saved us a lot of problems, I suppose, over the past couple years. But I don't think, there's certainly nothing that's happened so far that indicates that America can protect itself with just the clandestine service and the special forces, even if there was a lot more of them, which there probably can't be because they all go to work for Blackwater and the people that pay more money.
Okay, I think this will be our last question. Yes.
Leanne Hard, Federal Aviation Administration. If we were able to extricate ourselves from the Middle East in the way that you've described, and we're able to put perhaps those resources into alternative forms of energy, can you describe your vision of what the United States might look like in terms of daily life for Americans, and as well as in terms of international relations and our foreign policy?
Probably not. What I would be looking for, I'm not an energy expert. I'm not an economist. What I look for in energy is a restoration of our ability to decide when we fight and when we don't fight. And to me, that's the most important thing. That we don't want to be in a position of having to use our military to ensure oil supplies, and to maintain an independence in our going to war. That's kind of what I'm looking for. Certainly, if we were self-sufficient in energy, the world would look much different, I think. As I was trying to say, would we care what happened in Saudi Arabia? Would we care, what happened in Kuwait? I would hope not. I don't know if that's the case. Maybe we would still want to install democracies with someplace. I can't do much better than that. I don't know what life would look like, ma'am. My life looks like what my wife tells me it looks like.
Well, thank you very much. We've certainly had a provocative discussion this morning. I'd like to just remind everybody that the Middle East Institute is nonpartisan. We don't take positions. These views do not necessarily represent the views of the Middle East Institute, but we're happy to provide a forum for provocative discussions. And thank you very much, Mr. Michael Scheuer. If you are interested in buying his book.
Michael Scheuer was in the CIA for over 2 decades as chief of the Osama bin Laden unit from 1996 to 1999 and a special advisor from 2001 to 2004. He's an adjunct professor of security studies at Georgetown University and also the author of Through Our Enemy's Eyes and Imperial Hubris. For more information, visit jamestown.org.